Here's a question that shows up in every writing group sooner or later. Does my book need a prologue? Most writers ask it backward. They've already written the prologue. Now they want to know if it's any good. Or worse, they post it online and wait for strangers to tell them. That backward order is the whole problem in miniature. A prologue written before its purpose is settled is a guess wearing a costume. It might read fine on the sentence level and still be the wrong move for the book. We're going to fix that order today. By the end of this session, you'll know how to test a prologue before you commit pages to it. You'll know how to fix one you've already written that isn't pulling its weight. And you'll know how to tell the difference between a prologue that's earning its place and one that's just a nervous throat clear before the real story starts. Let's start with what a prologue actually is. A prologue is not a warm-up. It's a separate scene, cut off from chapter 1 by time, place, or voice, that does one job and only one job. It makes the reader need chapter 1 more than they would have without it. That's the entire test, and it's worth saying twice, because writers talk themselves out of it constantly. The question is not, is this interesting on its own? The question is not, does this feel epic or moody or clever? The question is, does it raise the stakes, plant a question, or hand the reader a view they can't get anywhere else in the book? Does it do that so that when chapter 1 starts, it lands with more weight than it would have cold? Think of it as a lens the reader looks through for the rest of the book. Everything that happens later gets seen a little differently because of what the prologue showed first. If nothing changes about how the reader experiences chapter 1, the lens wasn't doing anything, and the pages were spent for free. So let's talk about why prologues fail. Almost every prologue that fails for one of 3 reasons, and they all trace back to the same root cause. The first failure is using the prologue as a continuation of chapter 1 with a fancier label. Same character, same timeline, same voice, no actual separation. If you could staple the prologue directly onto chapter 1 with no seam showing, it was never a prologue. It was just an oddly labeled first scene. The second failure is using the prologue as backstory. History that explains the world or a character's past, delivered up front because it feels foundational. It almost never is. Backstory earns its place once the reader already wants it, and that want is rarely there on page 1. The third failure is using the prologue as a world-building prelude, a tour of the map, the political history, or the rules of the magic system. However lovingly built, it's dressed up as a scene when it's really exposition in a costume. All 3 come from the same mistake. The writers skipped the purpose step and went straight to the writing. They had an instinct that something needed to come before chapter 1. And instead of pinning down what that something was supposed to accomplish, they just started typing. Here's the fix, and it takes about 30 seconds if you're honest with yourself. Before you write a single line of a prologue, answer this question out loud. What is the one thing my reader must know or feel by the end of this scene? Not 2 things. Not a general mood. One thing, stated plainly enough that you could write it on a sticky note and put it on your monitor. Something like, the reader must know the monster is actually the victim. Or, the reader must feel the true scale of what's at stake before anyone in the story does. If you can't answer that in one clean sentence, you don't have a prologue yet. You have an instinct, and instincts are worth listening to. They're often the writer's radar picking up something real, but they need a destination before they become pages. Write the destination down first. The scene will follow it far more easily than you expect. So when does that instinct turn into a real yes? There are 4 valid reasons to reach for a prologue. Reach for one when a moment near the climax needs to be felt early. That way, the middle of the book carries tension the characters themselves don't feel yet. Reach for one when a character or a threat exists outside chapter 1's reach. The reader benefits from meeting it before the protagonist does. Reach for one when the tone or voice of the piece needs a frame the main narrative, told straight, can't supply on its own. And reach for one when dramatic irony is the actual point. That's when the reader needs to know something the characters don't. And that gap is where the tension of the whole book is going to live. If none of those four are true, the honest move isn't to force a prologue anyway. It's to put that energy into strengthening chapter 1. A weak first chapter propped up by an exciting prologue is still a weak first chapter. And readers remember the letdown of that drop in energy for a long time. Now, here's a piece of permission most writers don't know they're allowed to take. Your prologue's voice does not need to match your story's voice. An omniscient, mythic narrator can open a book that spends the rest of its pages in one character's close first person. That gap between voices isn't a mistake sitting there waiting to be caught by an editor. Used on purpose, it's a signal to the reader that they're standing somewhere different for just a moment. It tells them this before the story hands them off to the voice they'll spend the book with. This is where a lot of newer writers get nervous. They've been told consistency matters, so they assume that rule starts on page 1. It doesn't. Consistency matters within a section. The prologue is allowed to be its own section, with its own rules, as long as the shift is deliberate rather than accidental. Now, let's talk about shape. A prologue isn't a mood board. It's a story, just a very small one. And it needs the same bones any scene needs. It needs a beginning that plants a character and a goal inside a specific setting. It needs a middle that introduces an obstacle or a conflict and lets the tension build. And it needs an end that resolves just enough of the prologue's own question to feel complete. But that ending should open a much bigger question, one that only chapter 1 and beyond can answer. That last part is the piece writers most often get wrong. The end of a prologue should not feel like closure. It should feel like a held breath. If the reader exhales completely after the prologue's last line, you've spent your best material too early. Let's look at how this plays out in practice. From a far future science fiction space opera called Heat and Light. Its prologue is voiced by an intelligence the reader hasn't met yet. It speaks after some vast, unnamed reckoning has already happened. It opens by talking about the birth of the universe itself, and a problem buried inside it. It's something the narrator describes as having to become ruler of the cosmos in order to face. Notice what that prologue does not do. It doesn't explain the ship, the crew, or the plot mechanics that are about to follow. It tells the reader almost nothing about how the story works. What it delivers instead is scale and cost. It gives the feeling that whatever is coming carries a weight far larger than one captain and one ship. By the time the protagonist's own voice takes over in chapter 1, grounded and human and much smaller in scope, the reader already knows something. They know there's a far bigger shape looming behind him. That's the outside perspective doing its job. A voice the reader doesn't recognize yet, watching from a vantage point the protagonist himself doesn't have. So let's bring it all back together. A prologue is not decoration, and it is not a warm-up. It's a separate scene that earns its place by making chapter 1 land harder. Before you write it, run the 30-second test. Name the one thing your reader must know or feel. Check it against the 4 valid reasons. And if none of them hold, spend that energy on chapter 1 instead. Give your prologue the shape of a real story, with a beginning, a middle, and an ending that feels like a held breath. Let its voice stand apart if the shift is deliberate. Do that, and your prologue stops being a guess wearing a costume. It becomes the lens your reader looks through for the rest of the book.